The Batta Mutiny of 1766. How John McGowan received his first commission in the Bengal Army. Since we are all family historians, we generally enjoy the Who Do You Think You Are series on BBC television. Since we are all British India family historians, we particularly enjoyed watching the McGowan dynasty, explained to us on one of these programs in 2007. Those of you who did watch it will remember the scene in which Alistair MacGowan was surprised to see that his 6th or 7th great-grandfather came not from Scotland, but from Ireland. I was more surprised to note that, in the record consulted, Alistair's ancestor John McGowan is described as a sergeant, whereas later on he's recorded as an officer, and even, by the time of his death, as a major general. The presentation even gave the impression that this was the normal career progression. Well, it was most certainly not. Promotion to officer from the ranks was occasionally possible, and for 3 reasons. Firstly, the forlorn hope. When a fortress or fortified town was being besieged, the artillery would play their cannons on a suitable stretch of wall for a few days until a breach was made. Alternatively, the sappers and miners would sap or tunnel their way towards the gate, pile a few barrels of gunpowder underneath the gate, light the blue touch paper and retire immediately. The gate would disappear in a cloud of debris. In either case, a junior officer or sergeant would volunteer to lead his company into the breach. A forlorn hope indeed. If successful, and that meant surviving, the sergeant would be entitled to a commission as an officer. Secondly, by capturing the enemy's standard. If during a pitched battle a soldier managed to wrest and retain a standard from an enemy defender, and if he survived, he would be entitled to a commission. I have to admit that, being a schoolboy at heart, one of my heroes is Bernard Cornwall's Richard Sharp. He was an orphan from the Sheffield workhouse who joined Wellington in the Peninsula and captured one of Napoleon's eagles. Wellington promoted him as an officer, and of course, according to the subsequent stories, he was at least as responsible as Wellington for winning the Peninsular War. But one of the difficulties of hailing from the workhouse is that customs and practices there did not suit the officer's mess. Knowing how to read and write, and how to use a knife and fork properly, were as necessary as bravery for an officer. So promotion by these means could prove socially very uncomfortable, both for the ranker and for his fellow officers. There was a third way for promotion. There were generally a number of so-called gentleman rankers. These were gentlemen who joined the army to see the world, but whose family could not afford the huge sums needed to purchase a commission, or who did not have the right connections to recommend a cadetship. Later in their career, their ability, education, and gentle birth might be considered and recognized at a time when an officership became urgently vacant with no individual cadet available to accept it. They would then appoint a gentleman ranker. My strong suspicion, very strong suspicion, is that John McGowan was initially a gentleman ranker. A particular feature supporting this, or at least indicating that John was well educated, was that he called his son Suetonius. The average man from the Sheffield workhouse would not have the education to know who Suetonius was. Being all well educated today, we all know, of course, who Suetonius was. For those who might not have been at school the day that this was taught, there were in fact 2 Suetonii. One was a 1st century historian and political commentator. He wrote biographies of 3 of the Caesars. The other was Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who was the Roman commander in Britain who put down the rebellion of Queen Boadicea and her tribe, the Iceni. I'm not sure whether John had a career of a historian or of a commander-in-chief in mind for his son. Whilst on the subject of ancient Rome, it's interesting to note that one of John's fellow officers in the Bengal Army rejoiced in the name of Lieutenant Julius Caesar. So, what were the circumstances surrounding John's first commission? Let me provide a bit of the background. The 10 years leading to John's promotion were particularly active in India. The East India Company, in a story as much of duplicity as of blood, took over an area of India comparable in size with the British Isles. The company gained this territory in 3 stages. Firstly, following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the new Nawab, Mir Jafar, granted the company tax-collecting privileges in an area around Calcutta known as the 24 Parganas. Secondly, in 1760, the company helped to oust Mir Jafar from his position and replaced him as Nawab by his son-in-law Mir Qasim. As a reward, Mir Qasim gave the company tax-collecting rights from Burdwan, Midnapore and Chittagong. Finally, whilst Clive was in England, he had appointed a man called Van Sittart as governor of Calcutta. Van Sittart was a weak man and could not prevent the merchants breaking their obligations to the company. They undertook business on their own account and refused to pay the money due on taxes and customs duties to Mir Qasim. So desperately short of money, and despite many complaints, Mir Qasim put 140 British persons as hostages into prison in Patna. Still getting no redress, he eventually put them to death in October 1763. The commander-in-chief of the Bengal Army at that time was Sir Hector Munro. He did not like this, and he set out to avenge his fellow countrymen. His army had been strengthened by the addition of soldiers made redundant from the British Army regiments in India at the end of the 7 Years' War. Mir Qasim, on the other hand, had sought the help of the Mughal, and Munro met their combined armies at Buxar in October 1764. After a close-run thing, the British prevailed, and it is now recognized that Buxar was a much more strategically important battle than Plassey in the history of British rule in India. At the time of Buxar, Clive was on his way back to Bengal on the orders of the Court of Directors. He was to bring to heel the merchants and many of the army officers also involved in the unauthorized activities that were going on there. So, when he finally arrived in May 1765, Clive was first faced with negotiating with the Mughal in the aftermath of Buxar. These negotiations resulted in the transfer to the company of a large part of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa in the August of that year. But at the same time, he had to explain to the merchants and to his army officers, gung-ho following their military successes, that the gravy train had hit the buffers. Discipline and control had to be restored. No longer would they be allowed to flout the company's rules. They were in India at the company's expense and to engage in trade for the company alone. Faced with significant reductions in their personal income, both the merchants and the officers were naturally disgruntled, but they reluctantly accepted Clive's authority, with one exception. Each month, the officers received their salary, plus an expense allowance. This allowance was known as batta. In fact, as well as receiving batta from the company, they had historically been receiving one from the Nawab as well. In other words, they had been receiving double batta. With the company authority, Clive decreed that, with effect from the 1st of January 1766, they would receive only single batter, as of course did the officers of the other presidencies. For the officers, this was the last straw. They were determined not to lose their double batter. Now, in early 1766, the Bengal Army was divided into 3 brigades. First Brigade at Mongear under Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Fletcher. Secondly, the 2nd Brigade at Bankipore, near Patna, under Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Barker. And the 3rd Brigade at Allahabad under Colonel Smith. Officers of the 1st Brigade conspired together. They determined that if they would all resign their commissions together, Clive would have no option but to concede to their demands to resume the payment of double batter. He could not control an army with no officers. Their proposal was communicated to the officers of the 3rd Brigade, who agreed to go along with them. The officers of the 2nd Brigade were reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to join in also. The date set for the submission of the multiple resignations was the 1st of June 1766, and for them to become effective from the 15th of June. But the secret got out. Clive got to hear about the conspiracy on the 1st of May 1766. He was in Murshidabad at the time, not far from Plassey, and some 150 miles from Mongear. Immediately he grabbed his quill and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his council in Calcutta. He asked them to offer a commission in the army to all merchants and to any other gentlemen who were prepared to accept them. In the event, probably because Clive had recently curtailed their private activities, only 2 agreed to accept, out of 1,000 or so who could have done. Clive's second letter was to the council in Madras, saying essentially the same thing. He then proceeded to the 1st Brigade in Mongear. En route, Clive received a communication from Sir Robert Fletcher at Mongear, advising him of the imminent mutiny. He was quite evidently trying to cover his tracks, since later he was found guilty of having organized the mutiny. Clive arrived at Mongear on the 15th of May. He paraded the brigade and ordered the arrest of all the officers. They would be sent to Calcutta to face court-martial. He even offered his native soldiers a grant of money to ensure their officers' humiliation. The wind was naturally taken out of the mutineers' sails. They had no plan B. For many of them, their resolve evaporated and they begged for pardon. Clive appears largely to have relented, and he did pardon those he considered had been misled by the ringleaders. Clive then travelled on to Bankipore to the 3rd Division, and arrived there on the 20th of May, and effectively achieved the same effect. He did not bother to go on to Allahabad. He simply told Colonel Smith to retain those officers in whom he had confidence, and to send the others to Calcutta for court-martial. The mutiny was effectively over, but the army was now short of officers. I mentioned before that Clive appeared to relent and to pardon many of his mutinous officers. Although this was the effect, there are no records that I've come across which verify this. Details of events such as this should normally have been reported in the Bengal secret proceedings. These were diaries of the events in the Presidency which were sent back to London on a regular basis to keep the Court of Directors aware of what was happening in India. Unfortunately, indeed suspiciously, Entries in the Bengal secret proceedings between the 13th of March and the 12th of August 1766 are missing. They simply contain a note saying, "So much of our time and attention have been engaged in quelling the late dangerous mutiny among the officers that we could not transmit to you an account of the political and military operations," etc., etc. So, researchers are obliged to trawl through all sorts of other records to determine exactly what happened. However, in no record seems there to be a list of officers who actually mutinied. Indeed, later on, the House of Lords requested a report on the mutiny, and this was presented, actually 7 years after the event, by Henry Stretche. Stretche had been secretary to Lord Clive at the time of the mutiny, and of course very well placed to comment on the evolution of events. His report is well written and detailed. An account of all the events of the mutiny were given, accompanied by copies of letters sent at the time. However, apart from the leading players in the drama, no single officer is named. This leads to the strong suspicion that their names were deliberately expunged from all the records. On the other hand, the records in Madras are very full. They explain what happened there in excellent detail, with every, or seemingly every, officer named. I suppose that Clive would have put a first-class stamp on his letter to Madras. However, having been dispatched on the 1st of May, it did not arrive there until the 28th of May. By this time the mutiny itself was over, but of course this was unknown to the Madras Council. Their reaction at first was that they were too short of officers to help him, but having read the letter more closely, they understood Clive's predicament. They gave instructions to the Madras Commander-in-Chief, John Cayo, to try to muster support for Clive. Cayo was at Ellore at the time, a further 4 days' march to the north of Madras, and his army was dispersed to all the various garrisons all over the southeastern India. Cayo's decisions were, firstly, to increase the size of all infantry companies from 80 to 100 men. By this means, he could reduce the need for officers by some 25% and make them available for dispatch to Bengal. Secondly, to select by reputation certain non-commissioned officers for promotion as officers for the service in the Madras Presidency, so releasing existing officers for duty in Bengal. And thirdly, to select 4 non-commissioned officers for commission as officers and send them to Bengal. These men were all quartermasters or sergeant majors, and no sergeant is included. So, no mention is made of John McGowan. However, some 4 unnamed sergeants were also sent in charge of small detachments of troops for Clive's support, and it must be supposed that McGowan was one of these. We therefore also conclude that he was given his commission when he got to Bengal. The number of officers who were involved in the mutiny has variously been described as about 200, nearly 200, or in one case at the precise number of 173. To try to identify these, it is necessary to trawl through a large number of secondary sources. The recognized Bible of the services of Bengal officers from 1758 to 1834 is by Major V.C.P. Hodson, who devoted most of the later years of his life to researching them, and incidentally to those of the Madras and Bombay's armies as well. If we add those recorded in his books who were definitely, probably, or possibly involved in the mutiny, we can come up with only 82 names. This is far less than half of those estimated to have taken part, and so the cover-up was pretty effective. I have placed these names in the FIBIS database. Also in the database are the names of those officers who were sent to Bengal from Madras as a result of Clive's request. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there is no direct evidence of John McGowan's appointment to a commission, although his subsequent career is well documented and summarized in Hodson. The genealogically useful thing to do is to look once more at the muster list for the Madras Army in which he first appears. The mention of Ireland as its origin is very clear, and although others may query this, I would not normally do so. Beyond this, it records that he arrived in India aboard the ship Plassey in 1763. I've not managed to find a picture of Plassey, but I do have one for its sister ship, the True Britain, and this can be found on the Fibbers website also, by kind permission of the National Maritime Museum. I looked further at the 1765 muster list to see who else had arrived in Plassey in June 1763, and found only 3. The embarkation list for Plassey shows that there were a total of 36 recruits who embarked in her at the Isle of Wight on the 2nd of January 1766, and again the full list is on the Fibbers database. Once more, the elusive John McGowan does not feature. Furthermore, there is no mention of him in the commander's log for Plassey for her voyage to India in 1763. Of the recruits who did embark in Plassey for Madras in 1763 was a John Cowan, a 19-year-old sword cutler from Dublin. Since names were not infrequently misrecorded, I have wondered if he could be mistaken for John McGowan. For example, in the report of the wreck of the ship Winterton in 1792, the Gentleman's Magazine reported the passengers correctly as a Miss McGowan, for John's daughter, and incorrectly as Cadet Gowan, G-A-W-A-N, for his son, Cadet Suetonius McGowan. My original speculation, therefore, that this John Cowan might possibly have been our John McGowan has been set aside, following from my discussions with George McGowan, who has researched this family in great detail for some 45 years. Another possibility is that John McGowan may have travelled to India aboard Plassey not in 1763, but in her earlier voyage in 1761. Because the 7 Years' War was still at its height in 1761, further troops of the British Army were sent to India that year, and Plassey carried a large contingent of Colonel Monson's 96th Foot for Madras. None of these troops is named, and sadly no muster of the 96 survives in Kew. Nevertheless, John McGowan must have travelled to India somehow, and a recording of his journey might well give further details of his origin. A final word about John's rank at the time of his death. It will be seen that Hodson refers to his rank as Colonel in the company's Bengal Army. It may be known that it was frequently necessary to await dead men's shoes before officers could be promoted. However, if a man was worthy of promotion, even if there was no vacancy for him, he could be appointed to that rank by brevet. Furthermore, officers in the company's army also held commissions in the King's Army for that service in the East Indies. John McGowan was promoted to the rank of Major General by brevet in the King's Army on the 1st of January 1798. Since he died on the 30th of June that year, he might not have been aware of this honour at the time of his death. His obituary, published later in the Asiatic Annual Register, showed him to have been a very worthy officer, and, I'm sure, an ancestor to be proud of.